take this one? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Greenhaw, and I'll give a more formal introduction in a minute, but we wanted to welcome you this afternoon to this session today where we're going to have a conversation about anti-Semitism, how to confront it, combat it, to work against it, however we're able. And this conversation is going to be the two of us kind of having a conversation, and then at some point we'll open it up and have some conversation with you. We're imagining that we should finish in an hour and 10 minutes, maybe a little bit less, maybe a smidge more, but not too late. And we have very light snacks outside for you to help yourself when you're finished and continue the conversation outside. I want to welcome you on behalf of Naples United Church of Christ, where I'm currently serving as the interim senior minister. I have to remember my job title. My name is David Greenhaw. I'm an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ. I spent a great deal of my life in theological education. I served 23 years as the president at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis, which is one of the 7 seminaries of the United Church of Christ. Prior to that, I spent 7 years as the dean of Lancaster Theological Seminary, another seminary, and one more before that I taught at Vanderbilt University Divinity School in Nashville, Tennessee. So I've spent a lot of time teaching and just a little bit of time having fun, which is serving a local congregation. And this last year, I've been doing that here. I have a PhD in philosophical theology from Drew University. My field has nothing directly to do with anti-Semitism, but it has to do with preaching and worship, and that's my area of work. And I want to stop introducing myself and now welcome Rabbi Adam Miller. Rabbi Miller is at the Temple Shalom here in Naples, and he's going to introduce himself. So, Adam, welcome.
Thank you, Reverend Greenhaw. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation to be here and for the invitation particularly to be in dialogue with each other. I'll talk about that in a moment. But as a brief way of introduction, it's wonderful to be back here at Naples United Church of Christ, having been in this community on a number of occasions for different events and programs. So while we're up here representing different houses of faith, you should know that the two of us come from shared roots and that we're both Jayhawks.
That's it.
So we rock, chalk, Jayhawk.
Yeah.
This is our time of year as we get to college basketball.
Yeah.
And then I see Reverend Anderson out there, and I'm worried because he's going to take us both in a game of basketball. So I am the senior rabbi at Temple Shalom here in Naples, Florida. I've been in that position now for 12 and a half years. I studied for the rabbinate at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, which is the Reformed Seminary. I spent 1 year at the Jerusalem campus, 1 year at the Cincinnati campus, and then ended up doing 3 years at the New York campus before I was ordained about 20 years ago. Previously, I served congregations in the Boston area as well as in the New York area, and through all of it, interfaith work has been a part of my rabbinate, engaging in conversation and dialogue with the faiths of Abraham, the children of Abraham, and getting out and engaging in opportunities for us to learn from each other, grow with each other, and truly find ways to partner together in things. So I welcome the opportunity to be here with you today and to be engaging in this conversation and to be talking about this very important topic of anti-Semitism. And just a word here at the beginning, while that term has become part of our vocabulary, you should be aware that anti-Semitism itself is a relatively new term, relatively. It's only been around since the late 1800s. It was a term that came actually out of the pseudoscience of race being a source of identity, that your race, the pseudoscience believing that your race determined how strong you would be, how smart you would be, all those things that sadly we saw what happened with that when it came to the way that Nazis treated other individuals and how that science was manipulated. But the idea of anti-Semitism came out of that, of having a hatred towards those who are of a Semitic race, those particularly the Jewish people. But while it's only a little bit, that term is relatively new, hatred towards the Jewish community is sadly something that's been around for a long time.
Yeah, terribly long. And as I heard you say that, I wanted to say that I too have found interfaith work to be an increasingly important part of my own identity. I worked in St. Louis. I've been active in St. Louis, where our home has been, in the Interfaith Partnership of St. Louis, which has been a source of great growth and comfort for both myself, and it provides opportunities to do something. And I may just start here just for a moment. One of the things I found about it is that it provided an opportunity to get to know each other, so that when it was necessary that we stand up for each other, we didn't have to meet each other for the first time. And so conversations like this and other opportunities for interfaith activity, I think, are extremely important when it's time to say, to lean in and support each other. So
Absolutely, and that's why it's been valuable to have the organization that you actually helped found here recently, a new interfaith organization with a variety of clergy leaders, but also for us to get together in moments like this. And I think when we're talking about anti-Semitism, if you don't mind, I think it's helpful to have a little bit of history here at the beginning. If you'll pardon me, I just have a few notes just to make sure I cover the things that I think will be valuable for us as we have this discussion. And I think it's also good to root ourselves in a biblical text. Now, for most of those in the Jewish community, they don't think of this as a biblical text. They think of this as that warm song that we sing as we begin services. The words, Hine matov umanayim shevet achim gam yachad. It comes from Psalm 133. How wonderful it is when we would literally translate as brothers, but really it's when brothers and sisters can gather together. And how wonderful it is when we can be here like this and have these kinds of dialogue moments. Because we are all created truly in the divine image. And when the rabbis talk about that creation story and what it means, they do so in terms of trying to understand how can we all be created in the divine image, and yet here we all are, each of us, separate. And one of the ways they describe it is they say that what makes creation so special is that when someone goes to make a coin, they create one mold, and every time they stamp out the coin, it comes out exactly the same. And yet, when the Holy One, blessed be God, created humanity in the divine image, it's the image of God, and yet every single one of us is unique and different. Each of us blessed to have the divine image inside of us, to have that divine spark, but yet we're all separate and unique. And the rabbis teach that to say how wonderful is creation, how wonderful it is that we are all special and different, that we do have variations between us, but sadly, over the course of human history, we've seen far too many occasions when our differences were a source of strife. When we looked at each other as being different, not as a positive, but as a reason to put down the other, to treat those who were different than ourselves in a negative way. And hatred of the Jews is one of the most notable examples of that. Over the course of history, the Jewish people have suffered a great deal of oppression, whether you're going back to some of the biblical stories of being exiled to Babylonia, of the story just post-biblical of Hanukkah, where the Syrian Greeks came in, demanded all the Jews assimilate, and they fought back, and now we have the holiday of Hanukkah. The story of Purim, where all the Jews were threatened to be killed and eventually rose up. There's a theme here. There's a reason why in the Jewish community we have a joke, but it has a kernel of truth behind it. They oppressed us, we won, let's eat. We say that to recognize this pattern that's been there of being oppressed, but it continued on beyond those periods, being exiled from the land of Israel again by the Romans, being exiled from England, being forced out of Spain, the diaspora that sent the Sephardic Jewish community all around the Mediterranean and other places, to the point that whenever the Spanish or the Portuguese would conquer a new territory, the first thing that would happen is the Jewish community would quickly try to leave and flee because they feared what was going to happen with the Inquisition and the persecution they would face. You had blood libels across Europe when Christian children would be found killed in the wilderness, and the Jewish community would be blamed and often destroyed as a reaction to what had taken place. You had later on pogroms, and most recently the Holocaust. All examples of blind hatred for Jews as being the other. Something happened after World War II in that when we got past the Holocaust, suddenly people stopped talking about anti-Semitism for a while. And I truly believe that without any ill will, people believe that after having such a horrific experience in human history, that surely there could be no more anti-Semitism. People couldn't possibly think that way, feel that way, express those thoughts. But what happened is that it didn't just get instantly wiped out. It got pushed to the side. In fact, when we talk about American history, it's often the case that people sweep under the rug how prevalent anti-Semitism was here in this country. Even into the middle of the 20th century, you had American heroes, people like Charles Lindbergh, who was an open and active supporter of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. He has a swastika on his plane. The one that's at the Smithsonian has a swastika on it, not because he was captured, because he wanted it there. You had Henry Ford, who was such a virulent anti-Semite and hated the Jews so passionately that he helped to promote something known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Has anyone heard of that document before? A few heads, a few hands. For those who aren't familiar, during the pogroms in Russia in the late 1800s, in an effort to rile up the citizens, the Tsar's enforcement group came up with this document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Not written by the Jewish community, written by those who hated them, but it purported to be from the leaders of the Jewish community talking about how Jews control everything. We control the money, we control the market, we control the government, and therefore you should hate the Jews all the more. And they spread these lies all around, wherever the Tsar controlled. And it had the desired effect. It made those who are not Jewish hate the Jews all the more, despise them. Well, Henry Ford was so virulent in his hatred of the Jews that he printed the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in English and put a copy of it in the glove box of every car he sold for years. There's a reason why, to this day, there are still members of the Jewish community who will not buy a Ford. And that was out in the open. Yeah. You had people like Father Coughlin on the radio spouting anti-Semitism, and they weren't taking him off the air. There was open hatred. And it's easier for us now to wipe that away and say, oh, we must have been anti-Hitler because we fought the Germans in World War II. There were those who didn't want to fight because they supported the Nazis. It was out there. And what happened after World War II is it just went underground. But just because it was underground doesn't mean it was gone. And as we have seen in recent years, that hatred has begun to resurface more and more. It was always there in little pockets here and there, but it's become much more visible in recent times. I think in part because of places like the internet, where people can have anonymous conversations and spread this kind of misinformation, spread hatred without consequence. In part, it's because in the last 10, 15 years, we've become so polarized as a country that we are ripe for people to start promoting things that are about hating the other for being different than ourselves. And anti-Semitism is an old trope that just easily comes back in. Now, you might wonder, how does this affect us here in Southwest Florida? And I'd like to share with you the history of how we have a Jewish community here. One of our members, bless her soul, is 100 years old, actually 101 this year. And she came here in the mid-1950s, late 1950s, with her husband. They're from Philadelphia. They flew down to Miami, looked at property there. They heard about beautiful Naples on the Gulf, drove across to Naples, got out of their car to meet their realtor, who said, Mr. and Mrs. Weinfeld, you belong on the East Coast. You won't be welcome here. That's how open the anti-Semitism was in the 1950s. Now, in 1962, 5 families who had been able to rent properties or buy things here or there decided, you know what, if we want to change what's happening here, we have to start a congregation. And so exactly 60 years ago, in 1962, they began what's known today as Temple Shalom. It had a different name then. It's changed since that time. Those 5 families started it. Now it's 900 households and growing rapidly. The Jewish community here is growing rapidly. But it was a very difficult process. That anti-Semitism that had been here in the 1950s didn't disappear overnight. It stayed. And it was present even as recently in the 1980s. For those who don't know the story, in Port Royal, when you bought a home in Port Royal, it used to be that you had to first you'd buy the property, and then you had to go for an interview with the HOA. And they would often look down and say, oh, Mr. Cohen from New York City, Mrs. Schwartz from Chicago, yeah, it's not a good fit. And then in the 1980s, an attorney from Miami bought property here, but got put through the process, said, this is illegal. And he sued and he won. Ironically, he never actually lived here. But he changed the culture and changed the way people thought about it. And the culture here, don't get me wrong, has changed for the good. I mean, here I am, the rabbi of Temple Shalom, the largest and oldest synagogue, sitting in a church having a conversation with the lead minister. That wouldn't have happened 50 years ago. But also, to your point about people gathering together, after the 2016 election, when our synagogue sign was vandalized, some of you might remember this. The sign was shot, someone drove down Pine Ridge, got out of their car at 2 a.m., took a shotgun, vandalized the sign, and drove off. We had a gathering that next Friday night. More than 1,200 people came to Temple Shalom. The ministers from Naples United Church of Christ were there. Reverend Anderson was there. Many others came and spoke. It was a beautiful outpouring of emotion and strength and standing up to hatred in our community. Phenomenal experience. 2 years after that, when the tragedy happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the murder during services, we had almost 1,700 people at Temple Shalom. And it wasn't just the Jewish community. It was all the faith communities coming together to show support, love for each other. It's what we've built here. And I say that to be clear that there are a number of people here who I know don't accept anti-Semitism, don't accept hatred of any kind. I don't want you to think that we're painting everyone in this light, but we should know what was here. Because if we don't acknowledge our past, we're just allowing it to exist in the fringes and the shadows, and it's likely to come out. And we've seen it coming out here, sadly. We've seen it coming out last summer with the flyers that appeared on people's lawns that were full of anti-Semitic stereotypes. We've seen it coming out numerous times in our schools, sadly. I hear stories every year from students, more and more, I have to be honest, about fellow students throwing coins on the ground and saying, hey, Jew, pick those up. Or having swastikas drawn on their folders or notebooks. Recently at Palmetto Ridge High School, there was an art display up for 2 months that the students were begging to have taken down that was full of Nazi images and had no notice on it to say these are images of hate. They were just there. And the Jewish students said, please take this down. It's offensive to us. You're sending the wrong message. You're desensitizing people to these symbols, and the school fought it and wouldn't take it down. They finally did this week. There was an incident just last year at Barron Collier High School where a student from our congregation had his face photoshopped onto the body of someone who was an inmate at one of the concentration camps, wearing that iconic image of the striped outfit. And the caption that was put on the photo said, "My first day of camp, wish me luck." And this was sent to other students at the school. Now, on the one hand, the school punished the one who did it, but he wasn't alone. There are others who got it. It took time for people to react to this, and it was allowed to exist. More recently this fall, on one day at Naples High School, it was supposed to be a dress-up day, You had one student dress in a costume and call themselves the Jew slapper, and another student dress up, and I still can't believe this, as Adolf Hitler. It was 10 minutes before other students saw this and said, absolutely not, and literally ripped the mustache off of this student. But what does that say that people are even thinking these things, that they're doing these things? Some of you might even remember back to 2009, the incident at North Naples Middle School of Kick a Jew Day that made national news, not in the way we want to here. And that students had borrowed from the South Park cartoon where they had Kick a Ginger Day, kicking redheaded students in the cartoon, and said, we're going to do Kick a Jew Day, and literally walked around North Naples Middle School kicking the Jewish students. Now, again, afterwards as a response, we try to change it, we do teaching, but here we are 13 years later, and we're still dealing with these things. And in fact, they're getting worse. So to have this dialogue, to have this conversation is critical to us because we need to be addressing these things. And it's a national problem. Really, it's a national problem. Anti-Semitism, according to the ADL, the number of reported incidents nationally has grown by 50% each year of the last few years. It's at the highest level they've seen in decades. That's alarming. But I'm here with you, and I'm here with all of you because it's local too. And I'm a big believer that if we can address the local piece, if we are there for each other, we're having these kind of dialogues, the national part will take care of itself if we're working in every community to address these things. So this is a long background component, but I think it's valuable for this discussion. And, you know, I come here with you, Reverend Greenhaw, recognizing that you're a partner in this. And it's something that we've been dealing with here. What have you seen in other communities where you've been?
So I want to go there, but I want to follow up just a little bit because you said something that I've been thinking about. I used to call it the Bill Gates syndrome. When I'd feel guilty about the economic disparity between myself and people who are poor, I'd say, well, I'm not Bill Gates at least. You know, I don't have that much money. That one can take things and say, well, I'm, the Holocaust was so bad that it's really not that bad. That is, there's a way to paint things at the extreme, and therefore something that's less than that must not be important. And part of what I think I hear you describing is a need to be attentive, not to simply the worst extreme, but all of the ways in which it builds from in small, not insignificant, but not as large, but still worthy of our attention and commitment.
I think that's a great point. And to that, you're right. It takes the little things that build up to it. You know, one of the conversations I have when I go to visit schools and I'm invited in to talk, which I wish was more often. I'm always making myself available. Getting invited in is a challenge. But when I talk to students who've read Anne Frank or who have been reading Knight, I'll pose the question to them, how do you think this happened? Right. And they say, well, there are a few people this, a few people that. I say, well, but let's talk about how do we create this as a society? And we look at, and I show them how it built up of the dehumanizing of Jews over time. It wasn't an overnight thing. This didn't just happen like that. It was building up for decades, if not centuries, this hatred of the Jew as the other, a sense of resentment, seeing them as less than human in the language and the way you present them, so that when you get to that moment of saying, well, we think the Jews are the problem, people didn't argue with them because it had always been there. Because they had always allowed these stereotypes, they allowed the dehumanizing things to happen. So you're right, the small things do matter, but we look at the big piece and we get lost. Listen, there's a comment that's out there that says, the minute you bring in Hitler or the Holocaust, the conversation's over. Because immediately it's too much. You can't take it on. There's that story of the class from Tennessee, Whitwell, Tennessee. I don't know if anyone saw the movie Paperclips. It was about 20 years ago. Great documentary. So there was a community in Tennessee where they had no Jewish students. They'd never met most of the kids, someone who was identified as Jewish. But this middle school teacher is trying to get across the idea of, what is the Holocaust? It was too big for them. What does it mean 11 million people were killed? Okay, it's a number. It's so big I can't wrap my mind around it. So they challenged the students to collect 11 million paper clips. And over the course of the documentary, you see them going through this process, and it's mind-blowing for them to realize how many is 11 million. And I'll spoil it for you. It's been out for 20 years. At the end of it, they actually collect a little more than 11 million. They continue collecting beyond that, but they eventually raised money to purchase one of the train cars that had been used during the Holocaust to transport Jews to the camps, and they filled the car with 11 million paper clips. You can go there today, and they have a beautiful exhibit at the middle school of what the students have done, or you can watch the documentary if you don't want to drive up to Tennessee. But it I think, illuminates that problem we have of things like the Holocaust are so huge, we don't realize how little things can get us there, or we can't even wrap our minds around how big it really was, how many lives were destroyed, how many people were killed, and what was done in those moments.
Yeah, that's a helpful thing. You know, you talked about Tree of Life, and in St. Louis, we also did the same. We gathered at the JC, the Jewish Community Center, and the place was standing room only. It was packed in the largest room, and it was fairly easy to gather because it was so outrageous. It was so extraordinarily horrible. But a little later, someone went to the Jewish synagogue and knocked the tops off of several of the gravestones. And so, you know, the threshold of being outraged is, you know, that you can. This is a low threshold. You cross that threshold when you do Tree of Life, but it's a little higher here. Do you get outraged or not? And the community did, and they gathered almost the same number of people and went and cleaned up the cemetery together. Christians were leading the effort to clean up, and so were Muslims and Buddhists and Hindu and Baha'i, all working together to do it. And the issue is, where is the right threshold? Because if the threshold is the Holocaust, then everything else is nothing. If the threshold is killing a Tree of Life, well, maybe it's nothing. But if it's shooting a sign, how is that? Well, it's still important. It still requires us to say this is not just wrong. This is an actual act of violence, of hatred, and it's rooted in a community that says it's all right. If the community says it's all right and it's acceptable, then you can escalate to the next level. And so the notion that one stays close to what the threshold of outrage is, to set the moral outrage, the threshold of moral outrage, it really requires communities to work together and to say, this is not acceptable. And why is it not acceptable? That seems to me to be one of the things we need to probe a little bit. And you and I can talk about that a little more, but let me take a stab at it. It seems to me that, first of all, it was fairly easy to gasp at kids being kicked. Children bully each other, and we think, well, that's kids being kids. The consequences of having someone hate you, having someone revile you, having someone beat you, it has an incredibly profound impact. And anyone who ever, and most of us had some experience of being bullied, it has a profound impact. It's worthy of saying, well, this is not acceptable. We don't do this. We don't say, kids will be kids. It's not acceptable. And it's particularly not acceptable if it has this root in ethnic hatred, in religious hatred, in anti-Semitism, in a particularly, as you described it well, this long, strong history of directed hatred towards Jews. And part of what I'm interested in, Rabbi Miller, is I'm interested in why the role that Christians have played in this. Christians we're good, loving people. We're supposed to be great, loving people. But in fact, we've planted seeds and had harvests that are extraordinarily awful. from something as obvious as the cooperation of the churches, in fact, the leadership and support of the churches in Germany, but more so in the acceptance of theological positions that treat Jews as if they're an immature religion that Christianity is able to supersede. And the whole notion of Christian supersession, that Christians are we're the grown-ups, even though, that's the old-fashioned Judaism. That notion, it lives. It lives in our communities. And I just want to say, as a Christian theologian, as a pastor of a church, as a community of Christian believers, that's not true. That we actually share a wonderful heritage and an incredible future together. This earth that we live on, we share this earth. If we're going to live together, it's this earth we're going to share. We have a future together that we need to pay attention to, and to see the other as in any way religiously inferior is theologically wrong. It's morally wrong, it's religiously wrong, and that source, as any kind of a source to promote hatred, I just have to say it's wrong. And if we don't, as Christians, this is our own housework we have to do, if we don't rid ourselves of the vestiges of such hatred, we won't be able to be good neighbors and partners and co-workers in the work against anti-Semitism. You and I were just talking about this a little bit a minute ago. One of the kind of crazy myths that's going on right now is, oh, poor Christians, we're so persecuted. We can't say Christmas just anywhere. We have to say Merry Christmas, and we've been kept. And Christians are still, we're shrinking. Our churches are shrinking, but we are not shrunk. We still are by far and away the vast majority of people in the country, and we have lots of influence and access and power that we can use abusively or we can use constructively. Let us continue to pray that we use it constructively and not abusively.
A lot of profound statements in there, and a lot of ground for me to cover. I think before I get into the deeper components of the interfaith element of it, and I'm not going to ignore it, but I want to pause for a moment and get back to where you started with thresholds, because I think that in and of itself is a telling part of the conversation. It says a lot that, for example, our local Holocaust Museum also calls itself an education center. And they dedicate themselves not just to telling the story of what happened during the Holocaust, but also identifying other examples of genocide and teaching the message that students have to be upstanders. You can't be a bystander. Teaching the message that when someone's being bullied, when someone's being dehumanized, when someone's being separated or identified as the other, that is in and of itself a step towards what can happen. And I think that's an important piece of this. There's not a solid answer on the threshold question, though, because I also think that, unfortunately, and maybe this is part of the polarized society, we are all too quick to judge people who might not know what the difference is. And I'm a big believer, as a rabbi, as an educator, as a human, I want to give people the benefit of the doubt. So when I hear someone say something or do something that I think might have stepped over a line or a threshold, I'm very careful not to just call them out in that moment. I will find ways to talk to that person afterwards and say, can we talk about what just happened? I wasn't comfortable with that, or there are some people who might not like that term. As Jews, sometimes I hear people say, and they might not even know who's around them, I'll hear someone say, oh, I really wanted to buy this, but the person Jewed me down and I had to pay a lot more than I didn't get as much out of it as I wanted to. And in that moment, you have a choice. You can say, hey, don't say that, which now you're on the defensive, it changes it. Or you can pull that person aside later on and say, I found that term offensive. Let me tell you why. And I find more often that when you approach people with an element of respect, in that you approach them to have a conversation rather than judge them and punish them, then you get a lot further in what you're able to accomplish. Was it last year or within the last couple of years, you had a couple of high-profile incidents of people making anti-Semitic comments in public. One of them is Nick Cannon, who some of you might know is an actor. He's hosts a lot of different shows on television, and he made some very terrible anti-Semitic comments in social media. And a number of people immediately said, cancel him. And they started taking away his jobs and saying this and that. And one of the rabbis from the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles reached out to him and said, hey, can we talk? I want to talk to you about what you said because I want you to know what I'm hearing. And they met, and he toured around the Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, and by the time the conversation was done, Nick Cannon was signed up to bring other people back to talk about it, and went public and said, I was wrong to say what I said. It came from a place of ignorance. I want to learn and to do better. I think that has a lot more value than performative punishment. Right. And so I think we get caught, though, in this cycle where we say our threshold is whatever it is, and the second someone steps over, we're quick to go jump on them. You know, the student who did the meme, that terrible meme at the high school of taking the one student's head and putting it on the body of the concentration camp person, his parents reached out to me, and they said, Rabbi, we are horrified. Our friends are Jewish. He's been with other Jewish students for so long. Will you talk to him? Right. And I said, of course. He came and he met with me, and he was genuinely upset about what he had done and the impact it was having. Was it wrong? 100%. But we had an opportunity for an educational moment, after which, meeting with me, he went to the Holocaust Museum because he didn't realize the power of what he had done, taking that image and mixing the two together and sending it out. So I want to get back to your eventually. That really big question you threw on my lap of, hey, Rabbi, how do the Christians fit into this? So
don't go there yet. I want to take just 1 second with this. I want to
get to my own personal part, though, because I think that's important here.
All right.
Listen, do we have a couple years to talk about this? I don't know. Listen, I bring up the kids and I bring up the threshold piece because, for me, I will never forget the first time I encountered anti-Semitism. Right. 5th grade, I just moved from Michigan to Atlanta, Georgia, and I got off the school bus in tears. And my mom came up and said, what's wrong? Why are you crying? I said, Mom, the kids are just making fun of me. They told me I killed Jesus. They asked me if I had horns. They were blaming me and said it's all my fault. I had no idea what they were talking about. And my mom then had to sit there and explain to me, well, there are some people who mistakenly teach that Jews killed Jesus. It was the Romans who killed him. But she had to explain this all to me. I had no idea. I just got attacked on the school bus by a dozen kids screaming and yelling at me that I killed Christ and that I don't even know who Christ is, that I killed Christ, and then asking me if they can see my horns. I'd never encountered that before. Right. And I know looking back now as an adult, I know that had to come from somewhere. Yeah. That doesn't just pop into their heads. Someone was giving them that message, not realizing, maybe not anticipating, this is how it's going to translate into the way they're going to treat this other little child. And to me, that's why thresholds are important. That's why it's important to be careful in what we're saying and what we're teaching, because if we don't educate well, we get to moments like that. If we don't educate well, we get to moments where people say, my life's not going well. I keep hearing that the Jews have all the money. I blame the Jews for rising inflation, and I'm going to go do something violent. And it just spins out of control from there. So I think these are all very important, cutting these things off short. I'll let you jump in, and I want to get back to that bigger question.
I want you to get back to it, but let me just take this 1 second, because I think one of the things that you said, if I hear you correctly, is that the threshold in part is to take time to figure out the impact that something has on someone else. So vandalism in a cemetery is one thing. Vandalism in a Jewish cemetery, I learned more, is that part of the first thing the Jewish community has to do is to have a place for burial. And the meaning of that in the community was different than the meaning in the Christian community. And to learn what that means, to hear those stories, to understand it, it changes the threshold if you take the moment to listen. As you described the cruelty of these children on the school bus and the impact it has, it helps. This young man that you described, this boy who did the meme, his communication, his hearing, his appreciation of the impact of what he said makes a difference. And I just think that the nuance of these thresholds shouldn't be set by, it should be set by the conversations we have with each other, hearing the hurt that's involved.
Right, and look, the thresholds are important, but what's also noteworthy is when that student came and talked to me, he was someone of Hispanic heritage, and he shared with me he wrestled with the fact that kids often made fun of him and made migrant worker jokes around him, or poked fun at him for speaking Spanish as his first language. And I have no doubt in my mind, and this is not to excuse what he did, but if the threshold is already allowing those things to exist, it only goes so much further to do the next step. You and I both know the words of Pastor Niemöller. First, they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and no one's left to speak out. Now, what I love about his poem is that he never told that in the same order twice. When he would speak, he would always change around the order of the groups he was recognizing because he didn't want it to become, these are just the groups you have to look out for. His message was, everyone is important. Right. The threshold should be that nobody should be getting alienated and dehumanized, because once any group is going there, it's a slippery slope to see who's next, who's next, who's next. Yeah. And so that's the threshold. All right,
so beyond the threshold, go back now, come back.
To the big question, all right. So let me start here first. Yeah. I am not a historian, and I'm not a scholar of history that I'm going to be able to cite all those sources. If you want that, though, I have a good book for you. James Carroll, who was a reporter for the Boston Globe, and his life before that had actually studied for the priesthood, wrote what I consider to be the definitive tome on the relationship between the church and anti-Semitism. It's called Constantine's Sword. It is, now listen, if you're looking for light beach reading, this is not it. It is yay big. And Constantine's Sword is a powerful exploration of the history of Christianity and demonizing of the Jewish community. And he goes through about 2,000 years worth of history to get you to today. It is very powerful. It is very moving. We actually had James Carroll here in our community about 12 years ago, and it was sold out. We had about 800 people at Temple Shalom. It was very powerful to hear him speak. The book is wonderful. I highly recommend it if you want to know the deep dive on this. Right. The shorter version of this is that, yes, stories about blaming the Jews for the killing of Jesus, efforts to portray the Jews as being other or being wicked or being evil in some way, have most definitely been the seeds for what we recognize today as anti-Semitism. And I say that with a heaviness in my heart because I look at many of my Christian peers, colleagues, and friends as partners in the work that we do today to repair that damage. But if I'm going to be honest, I have to acknowledge it. And it's an honest conversation. Now, some of it stems from the origins of Christianity. It started as a group of Judeo-Christians who were making the effort to separate themselves. And one of the ways you separate yourself is by portraying another group as the other. We see it in threads of Christianity in the way that Jews are referred to in some of the Gospels and in some of the later church writings. You see it as well in some of the rabbinic writings from that period as well, where you see some of the rabbinic texts trying to ostracize those who identify as being Judeo-Christians from the mainstream Jewish community. There was tension from both sides. But by engaging with the Roman Catholic, with the Roman Empire, by leading to the conversion of Constantine and others following that mission, it became very much a question of Christianity demonizing Jews, and it led to some pretty horrific things. Among those, if we're picking out places, moments in history, there's moments like during the Crusades, when on their way to go liberate the Holy Land, oftentimes the Christian crusaders would devastate Jewish communities they encountered along the way, using the Jews as target practice. You had what I described before, the blood libels, that in medieval Christian communities, if a Christian child was found dead and they didn't know the cause, they would immediately blame the Jewish community. They accused them specifically of taking the blood of the child to use to make matzah, which is abhorrent on more levels than I can possibly describe. And by the way, if you know anything about Jews, we are forbidden from eating blood, so it's completely nonsensical. The Jewish community didn't understand it, but they would be blamed and then would pay the price as they were being attacked and driven out. You had Jews being forced to convert in many times, historically speaking. You had the expulsion from Spain and Portugal, which coincidentally, by accident, led to the founding of a Jewish community in North America. That there were Jews living in Brazil under the Dutch Empire, and when the Portuguese came to conquer Brazil, they fled for their lives, fearing they were going to be immediately tortured or forced to convert or killed, or even all three at once. So where did they flee to? They fled to another Dutch colony. They tried to flee to many of them. They finally settled in New Amsterdam in 1654, founding the first Jewish community that congregation still exists today. But would that they didn't have to flee for their lives. And the seeds of that hatred of Jews kept going for centuries and centuries. Part of the challenge we face, quite honestly, is that the seeds were planted so long ago and nurtured for so long, that hatred, that it's not going to disappear in a generation. It's not going to disappear in 2 or 3 generations. It's going to take centuries of work to undo those teachings, to undo those stereotypes, to unwind all that has been done. And it's part of why, when I go back to what I said at the beginning, it was such a mistake to assume that after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism had just been wiped away. Because it was there, underneath the surface, and it wasn't being dealt with. And we're seeing it pop up in lots of places now. The white nationalist movement. There's a interesting individual, his name is Eric Ward. He's a person of color, and in doing some work, actually managed to get into the white nationalist movement, which you might think doesn't make sense, but he got in by telling them that he agreed with them and he thought they were right, that whites were the supreme race. And when he was inside, he writes about what his experience was, and his experience is that all of the language and the materials he was coming across, not only were they saying that people of color were the problem, but on every single instance, it was people of color being supported by the Jews. That the Jews were propping up minority workers, that the Jews were the ones who were giving entitlements to people of color, that the Jews were at the evil of everything in the white nationalist movement.
Yeah.
And that's something we don't talk about, but that group is spreading. And we're seeing them show up in places like Jacksonville, Florida. They had a couple weeks ago, there was the National Day of Hate that was threatened. You have these things popping up over and over again, and it's scary that this is winding back up, and we need voices to say, no, this is not acceptable. This is not all right. There are not good people behind this. This is the wrong thing to be doing. And yet we see politicians and other people using language and courting with ideas that used to be on the fringe, that more and more portray Jews with stereotypes and in ways that are very dangerous.
I think the danger and the fear is, you say it's scary. I think it is scary. What scares me maybe more than anything is how easy it is to grow numb to things, to expect things to just be this way. Well, it's the way things are. Well, you described the length of time it takes to change these things that are long, deeply seated. It turns out that I became a theological student and started to study when the whole generation of my teachers were people who were shaping their Christian theological, they were the Christian theological issue for the West, for European and American theology, began with the Holocaust. The problem is that if Christians could participate in this, if Christian theology were to the point that you could, in good conscience, be able to support something as abhorrent, then something has to be rethought all the way to the bottom. You have to go all the way back and start again. The roots of that were actually already at work among some Christian theologians around the issue of slavery. That if Christian theology could support the institution of stealing human beings and selling them, if that were possible, what's wrong with Christian faith that it could do that? This is a deeply flawed religion if, at its core, it supports these two sorts of atrocities, slavery in America and the Holocaust in Germany. If these things were possible, what's wrong with theology? And it's led to a series of really important theological movements, often going by the title of liberation theology, to try to rethink theology from a completely different perspective. It, of course, hasn't purged itself of these things, but one of the important things it's done, and that's what I was trying to say so quickly before, that maybe too quickly to say it, is that one of the things it recognized is that in many of our biblical texts and our sources, the idea that the triumph of Christianity is a dominating triumph, to triumph over nature, to triumph over other cultures, to triumph. And such triumphalism has fueled and fed a really abhorrent set of practices in the world that one can look to Christian theology as a contributor to. So to have to take your fundamental religious values and raise a question about them because they might contribute to hatred, because they might result in these things. This has been a really important thing in the Christian churches.
Well, I think it's important to note, though, I don't know this is, every faith group wrestles with extremism, with fundamentalism, with elements that want to interpret texts or traditions in such a way that they can justify what ordinarily we would describe as morally abhorrent behavior with textual background. And I say that because I want to separate some of where you're going from anti-Semitism. You know, you can, for a moment, if we step away from that conversation, there were rabbis who supported slavery, which mind-blowing today because you look at it and say, wait, we were slaves in Egypt, how? But there were those who cited texts. They were not the majority, they were the minority, but there were some who said, but our texts say that slavery is a different kind of servitude that's in the text that was what was happening here, but they were trying to justify the behavior. There are extremists in every group who today use their extreme views to get to violence. I think that's a problem every faith group has to deal with, is figuring out how can you do what the rabbis were talking about at the beginning in that opening story. How can you both celebrate your own uniqueness and be respectful of the uniqueness of others? And that's a hard thing for some people to wrap their minds around. And I think that's where I think anti-Semitism draws its roots. I think that's where a lot of hatred draws its roots. Is people who can't accept those who are different than them in some way.
So I completely agree, but I want to be careful and not let Christians off so easily. You're generous to do so by making a point that it's extreme, But it wasn't the extremes in Germany. It was the very minority that stood against Hitler. It was the remainder of the Christian church that both supported, encouraged, not just give aid and comfort, but actually thought leadership and actual leadership. There are reasons, not just, and I don't want to just go there. If one looks at there's a lot of things about the Christian church that I love deeply, and Christian theology that I am absolutely committed to, that requires us to say the consequences of some of our theological understandings lead down a road that we cannot go, and that we need now to rethink. And any road in Christian faith that leads down a road that denigrates, that perpetuates and participates in what results in anti-Semitism must be rethought from the beginning. It's not, if that's where it leads, we have to go back and think again. And that invitation, that vocation, that call of thinking again, I think is really important. And in my view, it's one of the ways in which we can combat anti-Semitism. Because, you know, the school bus litany that you received that was just pure and total ignorance, as you say, it had roots. There are people who, I mean, we have a whole religious holiday coming about the crucifixion. The death of Jesus is important in Christian faith. It's central to Christian faith. And to link it to a notion that somehow he's been killed by the Jews is just, and I've heard that, you've heard it, you heard it in school. That's just so wrong. And it's important for us to say that it's wrong. Now,
I appreciate that. Don't get me wrong. I appreciate you taking ownership of that piece of it. And it's a lot easier for you. It sounds a lot better coming from you than coming from me when talking about the Christianity. I want to, but I do think we have to be mindful that there are extremes everywhere.
That's right.
And that's part of it. And listen, I also want to emphasize how important it is to be having this conversation. And if I can take the point of privilege to shift it to our audience who are here, you know, I think about what is it that we can really benefit from here. It's a teaching from the Hasidic rabbis is that every person we should look at in the world that we meet, we should look at them not to think, how am I better than that person, but rather that every person has been given two gifts. And our responsibility is to figure out what are the things I can learn from that other person. What are the gifts that they can give to me? Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate-winning author of Night and Holocaust survivor who passed away a couple of years ago, took that notion and transferred it into this idea that what humanity needs is not tolerance, but respect for each other. That when you tolerate someone, you say, I don't really like you, but fine, you can stay here. You're not right, but fine, you can be over there. I think less of you. Respect means I look at you and I respect you and I want to learn from you. And you're you, I'm me, you're good to be you, I'm good to be me. We're different, but what can we learn from each other? A modern version of that. And the reason I bring this up is that, and this goes to a little bit of what I talked about before for thresholds, I don't think we have enough safe spaces where we can respect each other and create an atmosphere like this where we can interact with each other without fear of repercussion. That too often we jump to the judgment level rather than the respect piece. So I would love to, if we're open for questions, I'd love to take.
We should.
If there are questions people have, I know there's a microphone out there, and
I've been given the microphone to run around, and I'm going to take the privilege of owning the microphone for a moment to say, I'd like to take what you just said and give one little anecdote. I have a friend who's a member of your temple who invited me to the women's Passover meal. It was the most wonderful, joyous occasion. And she could sit there next to me and explain the various aspects of it. That's the kind of thing that we need to know each other better. We need to understand each other's religion rather than, I could go into a Catholic church and forget to cross myself the right way or whatever. But by explaining it and inviting me to that joyous occasion, it makes all the difference. So, any other questions or comments?
So could I just suggest that one identifies yourself when you speak, just so it'd be helpful for us? So
I'm Jen Walker.
thanks.
Thank you, Jen.
Jen's the chair of our Justice Committee, the sponsor of this event today. So
I'm Jerry Schwartz. I'm struggling a little bit with the discussion, trying to relate it to maybe not the people in this room, but the younger people in our society who are doing some of these things. I can see the trace back to religious feelings that the Christians killed our Jesus. I mean, the Jews killed our Jesus. But is that what's driving the people today with anti-Semitism, or is it something else, other characteristics in either our society or the Jewish society? We're all one society. You two gentlemen, other than your yarmulke, I couldn't tell what your religion would be. So is there something else that's going on here in today's society?
It's a valuable...
First, you have to remember that he told you that Kansas basketball is our religion.
Well, he must have played.
No, he played. Reverend Anderson, he played basketball. Me, not nearly as much. Look, listen, for me, I think it's a good question, a very insightful one. I want to be clear. I don't think that the religious pieces we were talking about are the cause of today's anti-Semitism directly. The point of the conversation is that indirectly, they were part of millennia of planting seeds of hatred towards Jews and making it permissible to treat the Jews as others, to dehumanize them, to denigrate them, to disenfranchise them throughout history over the last 2,000 years. In part, it has its roots in, well, we blame them for other things. We hate them for things. They're the other. That's separating them. That's pulling them apart. And I think today, you have a lot of factors at play. You have the polarization of our society, where we are more and more separating ourselves and identifying ourselves. Well, if you're separating and you're pulling apart and you're polarizing, you're saying, I'm this, you're not. How am I? You're looking for the differences, not necessarily for the similarities, and that's something that's happening across not just American society, but the global society, polarization like that. You also have, as I said at work, spaces now where people can have conversations and spread conspiracies, can spread stereotypes, can spread hate, can spread lies, and there's no one there to be an arbiter of truth. There's no one there to turn the light on and say, hey, this isn't right. You shouldn't be talking about these things. And when they come out to light, we're all like, that's crazy. I mean, a few years ago, it came out that one of our members of Congress was posting things on social media about Jewish space lasers. You can joke about it and laugh about it or say, what are you talking about, Rabbi? Google it. And the fact that person was just mentioning something that other people are talking about tells you that there are dark corners of the internet out there where people are spreading these kinds of pieces that, while it's not the religious component where it started, that paved the way for where we are today. And it's having those places, that's why it's spreading today. And as a parent of 3 children, I know that many of their peers are given access to social media or to online pieces and are not being filtered. Parents are not always aware of what videos their kids are watching or what ads are popping up when they're playing that little game that's keeping them quiet in the restaurant. And because they're not talking about it, they're not discussing it, parents don't even realize what their kids are learning. And I'm not saying that, and please don't take me to be an anti-technology person or anti-social media person or say that all that's evil, but I think that part of that information source coming in unfiltered is part of the problem. And I think we have to do a better job of monitoring those things. And we often try to, sometimes get into side conversations about freedom of speech. But hate speech is never free. And that has to be our starting point. And if someone's talking about denigrating someone else, if someone's humiliating someone else, if someone's attacking someone else, That's not acceptable to us. And we need to put our feet down immediately and say, that's not right. And we all have to own that in every generation.
Hello, I'm Michael Finkel, and I want to go back to Pastor Niemöller because, again, the Jews, those of us who have Jewish ancestry too, are number one of the groups. But we've still seen in this country what happened in South Carolina, where a Christian church, where a black church was attacked, and certainly some of the anti-Muslim issues, and even some against Hindus and Sikhs. So we talked about what's going on with Jews here, but what about the other in this community?
So I appreciate you saying that, because I think it's important to recognize that hatred and mistreatment of groups, of demonizing and dehumanizing, happens lots of places. And I think we need to attend to it and to see the similarities, like you said. I think a kind of a fear of Muslims is really close to the surface. I think back on September 11th, if there were those attacks in one day, had there been another week later, another attack would happen. It would have made if some people would have a hard time. 2 weeks later of another one, if 3 or 4 more events had happened, people of goodwill, people you would never think would hate Muslims, would have turned against Muslims. So I think you're right to pay attention to the commonality of that. I also want to be really careful, though, because anti-Semitism is of a certain sort, and it is an extraordinarily strong and terrifying practice, and I think it's really important that we not just lump it in with everything else, that we really pay attention to it, because it has. And if you just think of how small this group is globally, what are we talking? 17 at the outer limits, 17 million Jews in the world today. It's a minuscule part of the world, and yet there's incredible hatred turned towards Jews, and it persists. And so I so appreciate what you're saying, but I also think it's incumbent on us to not just say, well, it's all hatred. It has a particular flavor, a particular style, and needs our attention. And there's good work being done. I just want to.
I want to say I'm really touched to hear that answer, and I appreciate it. But I also appreciate the question, because I think we all have to be speaking up for all forms of hate. And
right.
I'll say that as a Jewish community leader, I feel even more motivated to speak up when I see acts of racism, acts of bigamy, acts of against the LGBT community, all those things. I speak up probably faster than I would otherwise, because I know it could just as easily come back to me. I think about, you mentioned African Americans in South Carolina, and I think about one of my members tells a story that when he was a kid living in Atlanta in the 1960s, 50s and early 60s, he remembers vividly getting on the bus with his mother, and they'd sit in the front of the bus, and they'd watch the African Americans have to walk to the back of the bus, and his mother would turn to him and say, if it wasn't them, it would be us. And I think it's important to keep in mind that sense of hatred can't be allowed to live in any form. So while I'm very touched that you want to focus on anti-Semitism, and I appreciate that we're having this forum, I'd say let's have forums about everything else too, because sadly, hate often spawns more hate. Right. It all just percolates together. In Charlottesville, when they had the big riot in Charlottesville because they were taking down a Confederate statue, one of the pieces that wasn't as much covered but that happened in the community is 3 individuals with assault rifles marched outside the synagogue shouting, "The Jews will not replace us." They were there because of a Confederate statue, but the hatred spread in other ways. So I'm with you. Speak out against hatred of every kind, but I'm glad we're having this forum and this conversation today.
As am I. I'm Kurt Anderson. I'm pastor at Naples Community Church. And, you know, Martin Niemöller was part of what was called the Confessing Church. And the Confessing Church sort of emerged in 1933 after a huge rally in the sports arena, I think it was in Berlin. And one of the tenets of that, and this is Martin Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Karl Barth, and several others, one of the basic tenets of that was that the church is not to be co-opted by political ideology. We only wish theology would be so effective. That's what we do every single week.
Yeah.
But culture is so powerful. People who bind themselves together around what was friendship and acceptance, and then it becomes some kind of an ideology. We have a AA group at our church that meets, and they came together over friendship, and they got caught drinking too much and got stuck in this addiction. But the power of culture, I've grown up believing that the Jews were our parents, not less mature, but the more mature. They were the ones who nurtured the church. And if anything, the church has been sort of a bit of a prodigal in relationship with Judaism. And so I just think that we have to be aware of everything is so multifactorial. We have so many cultural pressures. And yes, those weirdos in northern Idaho that shave their heads, they are also an other. And somehow, and Rabbi has, as I think, rightly expressed the need to understand, to forgive, and to love. And it's really the love that has a transforming power. Just one quick story. Sorry, I'm a preacher.
Yeah.
I'll be quick. But I was out with my friends in high school, got home like at 1 o'clock at night. I was early driver because I was older than all the other kids, and we were out, a bunch of us out just bombing around town. I came in at about 1 o'clock. I turned the corner, and there was my mom sitting at the plate glass window. All she said was, "Kurt, I'm just glad you're home." I never did it again. I was transformed by love, and I never, ever got home late without telling mom or calling home. I never did again. So the real power that is at work in our synagogues and our churches and our temples and whatever is going to be the transforming power of love. And again, I thank you for this time.
Thank you. I'm going to have us, we promised we'd not go too long, and I don't want to do that because this is just the first of what should be, or maybe it's the 10th. I don't know. I don't want to keep count. It's a conversation that needs to keep going on. I really think the way that we love each other is when we show up for each other as well, when we support each other, when we eat together, when we find ways to share common cause, and when we remember that our community is the richer, the more we are able to enjoy our incredible diversity. Rabbi Miller, I am so grateful that you came here today, that we've had this conversation, and one of my big treats of being in Naples this year is to get to know you over this time. I know many of your classmates or folks who went to Hebrew Union, the current president of Hebrew Union, I got to know in a Jewish-Christian dialogue group when we talked about Israel together. That'll be another day for us to talk about, because Israel's another topic we have to talk about.
There's lots of topics to talk about.
That's right.
And it's been a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you, to be here with all of you, and to be having this moment. It doesn't matter what number it is. It's part of an important series of conversations and engagements we should all be having on this topic and many others. And I would end with that along those lines of love and being there for each other, is that the most important thing we should be doing for each other is speaking out for each other. that I will say, as a leader in the Jewish community, what gives me strength is when there's a moment that an anti-Semitic act happens, not that my phone rings and I hear from the news and all the other people who want to say, Rabbi, what do you think about this happening? But when I hear from colleagues and I hear from members of the community who are reaching out saying, are you okay? What can we do? When I see leaders of our community stepping up and saying, this is not welcome here. And I would encourage you, don't wait for the Jewish community to speak first. Give us strength by being our partners in love and using your voices, that when you hear someone using a stereotype, when you hear someone saying something inappropriate, when you see something happening, be the first to speak out, because that shows with an act of love that we are not alone, but that all of us, created in that same divine image, are holy, special, and unique, each of us for who we are.
Thank you very much. Great ending words. We're fortunate in that we are able to live stream this event, and there should be some opportunities to look at it again on YouTube later. If you found something useful, you may go back. We're so glad you were here today. Please join us for snacks on our gathering spot patio outside. So thank you all.